He had once ruled an entire valley, his roar a warning, his presence enough to scatter hyenas like dry leaves in wind. But now, the old lion lay crumpled beneath a thorn tree, flies gathering where his mane had once flared like fire. His ribs jutted like broken fence posts, his breath shallow, slow, deliberate. There was no pride left to mourn him, no rival left to fear him. Time had taken it all, his strength, his sons, even his name. And yet, in the cracked silence of the highlands, he refused to close his eyes. Not yet. Not while the sky still changed colors. Not while something inside him, small and wild and unbroken, still whispered, "You are not finished." If this lion's final stand moved you, don't just watch, be part of stories that matter. Subscribe now for more real, untold bonds between humans and the wild. The Mekong highlands were strangely still that morning. Mist clung to the hills like a memory refusing to lift. Somewhere far off, a hornbill cried out and went quiet again. The air smelled of dust, bark, and something older, like the breath of the land itself. Daniel Hayes leaned against the door of his weather-beaten field truck, one boot resting on a rock, the other braced against a loose patch of gravel. He hadn't spoken in hours. There was no one to speak to. Just silence and the message that had brought him here. Old male lion found near dead. No further interest. Let nature run its course. It wasn't even official. Just a forwarded radio note passed around by rangers until it hit someone too stubborn to ignore it. Daniel had driven 4 hours up into the ridges, away from paved roads, away from cell towers, past the conservation posts that were more about tourists than wildlife. He had no team. No plan. No permit. Just an old medical bag and a heaviness in his chest he hadn't been able to name since the incident in Namari. He still remembered the cub. Limp in his arms. Still warm. And how long he knelt in the sand afterward, apologizing to no one. The landscape changed as he climbed higher, greener, quieter. The trees twisted inward, old and half-burned from past lightning. The wind stopped trying to talk. Even the insects hushed, like they were waiting. Then he saw it. At the base of a gnarled acacia, a shape that might have been mistaken for a fallen log, until it moved. Daniel approached slowly, one hand resting on the tranquilizer holster he wouldn't use. 10 feet away, the lion lifted his head. A sunken face. Cheeks hollow. Scars etched across his muzzle like dry riverbeds. One eye half closed, the other dull amber. His mane, once the symbol of his reign, was patchy and grayed at the edges, matted with burrs and dried blood. A king, but no longer of anything. He was skeletal, his ribcage pressing against the skin like a cage trying to break out. His tail twitched once, weakly, then stilled. And yet, somehow, the animal didn't look defeated. Daniel knelt slowly. The lion did not growl. Did not retreat. Just blinked, as if even that took effort. "You're still breathing," Daniel said under his breath, as if that was the most surprising thing in the world. He reached into his bag and withdrew a collapsible dish. Filled it with water from his canteen. Pushed it forward across the dust. The lion didn't move. Not to sniff. Not to drink. But he also didn't look away. Daniel sat cross-legged, watching the rise and fall of the lion's sides. The rhythm was slow. Measured. Not the panic of something dying, but the breath of something that had already made peace with dying. Like an old man watching the sun set for the final time, not out of fear, but out of habit. After an hour, Daniel stood and set up a small shade tarp using metal rods and an old ranger poncho. It was the kind of thing that would have gotten him a citation in his former job. He didn't care. The sun was coming fast. The lion's skin was already cracked along the spine. He muttered apologies as he crouched beside him, dabbing antiseptic into a festering wound on his left shoulder. The lion flinched, but didn't swipe. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" Daniel murmured. He checked for tags. Scars suggested past battles, maybe even a snare wound around the back ankle, but no microchip. No collar. That meant no one had been tracking him. Which meant no one would notice he was gone. Except now. Daniel had. By sundown, Daniel had set up camp 10 yards away. A small cookstove, his tarp tent, and a single LED lantern that cast long shadows against the rocks. He boiled lentils and ate them straight from the pan, stealing glances toward the lion every few minutes. Still breathing. Still not moving. Occasionally blinking. That night, it was colder than expected. Daniel tossed a warm blanket over his shoulders and crawled out of his tent with a thermal scanner. He pointed it toward the lion. The heat signature was faint. Fading. He looked at the sky. Clear. Millions of stars. The kind of sky you only see when everything human is far behind you. And then he said something he hadn't said in years. Please, just make it till morning. The next morning, Daniel found the lion in the exact same place, but the water dish had been knocked over. And the meat he'd left out, a few slivers of jerky soaked in water, was gone. His heart stuttered. Not just because the lion had eaten, but because it meant he'd chosen to eat. Choice meant something. He approached again, slower than before. The lion's eye tracked him. Not a full motion, just a subtle shift of the iris. Awareness. Not instinct. Not fear. Presence. Daniel crouched beside him and set up on 4-line, no sedation. Just a needle and a loop of gauze. The lion flinched when it entered the vein, but didn't bite. Daniel whispered, "You want to live, don't you?" There was no answer. Of course not. But still, something in the air felt different. The kind of stillness before a song begins. For 3 days, Daniel kept him alive. Fluids. Bits of food. Medicated salve for the raw spots on his elbows. When hyenas passed nearby on the second night, the lion didn't growl, but his tail lifted slightly, twitching with something half buried in memory. And on the 4th morning, just before the sun broke over the eastern ridge, Daniel was awakened by a sound he hadn't heard in nearly a week. A low, guttural rumble. It wasn't a roar. It was weaker. Rough. Half-breath and half-groan. But it came from the lion's chest. Daniel sat up. The lion, impossibly, was lifting his head. Not high. Not proudly. But up. He looked directly at Daniel. And the sound came again. Not a warning. A statement. I am still here. Daniel sat on the dirt, across from him, breath frozen in his chest. This wasn't over. Not yet. And he knew then, without a doubt. He wasn't going to leave. Not until this lion decided it was time. On the 7th day, the wind changed. It swept down from the high ridges, cool and dry, pulling the heat from the dirt and the ache from Daniel's bones. He'd stopped counting time the way most people did. He didn't check his watch. He barely slept. The rhythm of his day was measured now by the lion's breathing, how steady it was, how many times the ribs lifted per minute, how long he could hold his head up before collapsing again. Kuma. That's what Daniel had started calling him, though no one else knew. It meant, endure, in the old Swahili dialect, the kind whispered by herders and elders in the valleys far below. It was a name that carried history, struggle, and in Daniel's mind, dignity. Kuma was still not standing. But he was trying. The muscles in his back legs twitched every time Daniel approached. Not in fear. In effort. That flicker of instinct to rise, to protect himself, even if the body had long given up the capacity to follow through. Each attempt cost him. Panting. Collapse. A groan that sounded like dry stone grinding beneath pressure. But he didn't stop. Every morning, just after the light came, he'd try again. And Daniel began to see something he hadn't expected. Will. Not hope. Hope was a human idea, frail, abstract. But will? That lived in the body. It was breath that refused to slow. Muscles that kept trying even when there was nothing left to push from. Will was what Daniel saw in Kuma's slow blinks, in the slight lean of his body toward the sun when it crested the slope. Daniel kept treating him like a patient, cleaning wounds, swapping for lines, applying cooling cloths. But slowly it became something else. The acts weren't medical. They were rituals. Habits born from presence. A man learning to wait without expecting reward. At night, Daniel wrote nothing in his field journal. Just the same 3 words. He is here. That week, he hiked 2 miles down to the ranger outpost. He needed more fluids, powdered goat milk, antiseptic. The officers looked at him like he'd gone mad. "You're still with that lion?" one of them asked. "He's still alive," Daniel replied. "But for what?" "He'll never walk again. Never hunt. Never be part of a pride." Daniel had heard this before. He remembered the speech. Let nature be nature. They always said that when the death was quiet and the cameras weren't rolling. But Daniel knew better. Nature wasn't just about letting things die. It was about what happened before the dying. The will to stay. The final fight. The breath you choose to take even when no one expects it from you. He returned to camp that night, exhausted, arms full of supplies. Kuma didn't lift his head. But his eyes followed Daniel across the clearing. That was enough. On the 10th day, it rained. Just briefly. Enough to leave the grass damp and the dirt cool. Daniel opened the tarp to let the breeze in, and when he returned to Kuma's side, he found the lion stretching. Slowly. Painfully. But moving nonetheless. Daniel knelt. Kuma shifted. Then, miraculously, he rolled onto his stomach. Not collapsed. Not stuck. Intentional. Daniel nearly laughed. Then cried. Then just sat there, his hand resting in the dust. "You stubborn bastard," he whispered. Kuma's ears flicked. He refused food that day but accepted water from a soaked cloth. Daniel pressed it gently to the lion's lips, and Kuma licked it once, then again, then turned his head as if to say, "That's enough. For now." Daniel slept lighter that night. His body ached from tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. He lay in the tent listening to the lion's breath and the rustle of wind in the grass. That's when the sound came. A growl. Soft. Raw. Half-formed. Daniel jolted upright. It wasn't aggression. It was more like a cough, but one that came from deep in the chest. The lion was dreaming. Eyes twitching. Tail shifting in slow, uneven movements. The growl came again. And Daniel understood. Kuma's body remembered what it meant to be alive. Even in sleep. By the second week, Daniel had changed. He no longer kept his distance. He sat beside Kuma for hours. Not speaking. Not touching. Just there. Breathing. Witnessing. He no longer checked the sat phone. No longer looked at news alerts or ranger messages. The world outside didn't matter here. Only what lived in that small stretch of earth. A lion. A man. And something neither of them could name. That afternoon, Daniel watched as Kuma pushed himself onto all fours. His front legs shook. Back legs trembled. For a moment, it looked like he would fall again. But he didn't. He stood. Wobbly. Scarred. Mane clumped in uneven patches. But upright. Daniel didn't dare move. He stayed on his knees, hands resting on the dirt. Watching. Kuma turned toward him. Their eyes met. Not as predator and prey. Not as rescuer and rescued. Just equals. Then the lion took one step forward. Then another. He walked less than 10 feet before collapsing again. But it was walking. And that changed everything. That evening, Daniel made a fire. Not for warmth, but for the moment. He sat with his back against a rock, staring at the flickering orange light. Kuma lay nearby, eyes half closed. The wind moved through the clearing like breath. "I thought I was done with this," Daniel said aloud. Kuma didn't move. "I thought I couldn't keep doing it. Watching them fade. Giving everything and losing them anyway." The fire crackled. Daniel glanced at the lion. "But maybe this isn't about saving." He paused. "Maybe it's about staying." Kuma let out a soft, chest-deep exhale. Almost a sigh. The next morning, the poachers came. 3 of them. On foot. armed. Daniel heard the footsteps before he saw them, boots crunching dry leaves. Voices low, confident. He stood fast, grabbing the flare gun from his tent. Not to shoot. To signal. But there was no one nearby to see. Kuma didn't growl. But his body tensed. Daniel stepped between the lion and the approaching figures. They paused at the edge of the clearing. Young men. Scarves wrapped around their faces. One of them whistled. Old lion, he said in Swahili. Not worth much. But maybe still good for the bones. Daniel raised the flare gun. I don't think so. The men laughed. One lifted his rifle slightly. Daniel's voice didn't tremble. You take one step closer, and I swear this entire hillside will know you're here. They hesitated. One of them said something under his breath. Then, finally, they turned. The threat lingered in the air long after they were gone. Daniel's hands were shaking. He sat down, hard on the ground. Kuma crawled toward him, one paw dragging slightly, until their shoulders almost touched. And Daniel knew, in the marrow of his bones, he hadn't just protected the lion. The lion had protected him too. The air had shifted again. After the poachers left, there was a stillness in the clearing, not the usual silence of the wild, but something deeper. Charged. As though both man and lion had crossed some invisible threshold. Neither spoke, of course. Kuma couldn't. Daniel didn't need to. What mattered now wasn't words, but presence. And presence was something Daniel had almost forgotten how to give. Before this place, before Kuma, his life had been a cycle of emergency deployments, rushing into wildlife conflict zones, patching up cheetahs mauled by snares, darting pregnant elephants injured in border skirmishes. He was good at it. Efficient. Detached. But with every mission, something inside him grew harder, thinner, quieter. He used to come home and stare at his hands for hours, hands that saved but never held. That healed but never stayed. Now those hands were stained with dirt from the highlands, callous from building makeshift shade shelters, trembling when they brushed the lion's scarred flank to check for infection. He was no longer just a field medic. He was a witness. And Kuma, somehow, was letting him be one. The days blurred together. Kuma began walking in short, awkward strides. Twice around the clearing. Then 3. Daniel followed, always a few feet behind, always quiet. Kuma didn't want help. He didn't need a leash, or coaxing. What he needed, what he demanded, was dignity. And Daniel gave it. He started recording their days on a battered handheld camera. Not for social media. Not for acclaim. Just for memory. For proof that the world still held space for this, a man kneeling beside an old lion, both of them out of time, both of them unwilling to quit. Sometimes the camera caught quiet moments, Kuma laying his chin on a rock, eyes closed, listening to distant wind. Other times, it captured the fight in his legs as he climbed a low slope for no reason other than because it was there. Each clip became a quiet hymn of defiance. But survival, Daniel knew, wasn't a straight road. It was a spiral. It looped. It faltered. And on the 22nd morning, Kuma didn't rise. He barely moved. Daniel crouched beside him, hands trembling. Checked his gums, pale. Pressed his side, no flinch. Breathing, slow again. Shallow. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. The fluids were doing less. The infection in his hip wound, once stable, had begun to spread. Daniel's throat tightened. He injected a slow-release antibiotic and sat beside the lion all afternoon, saying nothing. That night, Daniel didn't sleep in his tent. He lay on the dirt, a few feet from Kuma, wrapped in a weather-stiff blanket, staring at the stars. He wondered if Kuma was dying. But more than that, he wondered if he was ready to let him. At dawn, something strange happened. Kuma stood. Not slowly. Not in pain. He stood like a lion again. Daniel froze. The old male walked, limped, but with purpose, to the edge of the clearing. He paused. Looked back once. And roared. It wasn't loud. It wasn't full. But it was a roar. A sound that ripped the stillness open. A sound that said, "I am not gone yet." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Kuma walked another 30 yards and lay under the shadow of a stone ledge. He didn't move again for hours. But Daniel understood. The lion had chosen his ground. Not to die on. To belong to. Later that week, 2 young conservation interns hiked in from the southern ridge. They'd heard whispers about the man with the lion, and came with binoculars and clipboards, expecting to find a ghost or a myth. What they found was Daniel, washing out feeding bowls in the shade, and Kuma, sprawled nearby, eyes closed, chest rising and falling like a slow tide. The interns were stunned. One took a photo. The other began to ask questions, fast and shallow. Daniel waved them off. "He's not a story," he said quietly. "He's a life." They didn't understand. But that was fine. Kuma did. Time passed differently after that. Not in days. In moments. A day when Kuma chased off a jackal. A day when he let Daniel sit within arm's reach, close enough to see the golden flecks in his eye. A day when he refused food again, and Daniel felt panic grip his chest like ice. But always, somehow, the lion remained. Then came the drought. A dry season so cruel it turned rivers to rock beds and grass to dust. Daniel trucked in water twice a week, sometimes from as far as 40 kilometers. Kuma stopped walking much, conserving energy, but he didn't collapse. He didn't retreat. He waited. Daniel did too. One evening, Daniel sat beside him as the sky turned red. The wind smelled of scorched earth. Kuma's breathing was labored again. Daniel reached out. For the first time, the lion didn't flinch. He placed his hand against the side of Kuma's neck, feeling the pulse. It was weak. So was Daniel's voice when he spoke. "You're tired, aren't you?" The lion's ears twitched. "I don't blame you. I'm not sure what I'll be without this. Without you." For a long moment, there was only the sound of insects. Then Kuma leaned ever so slightly into Daniel's hand. A pressure. A weight. And then he pulled away. As if to say, "You will go on anyway." The next morning, Daniel woke to silence. The kind of silence that hurts. Kuma was still. Eyes half open. Body curled as if in sleep. But there was no breath. No rise. No fall. Just stillness. Daniel didn't cry right away. He sat down beside the body. Watched the light creep across the ground. Then, finally, he touched the lion's mane, now soft, even in death, and whispered, "You stayed longer than anyone thought. Longer than I deserved." He spent the rest of the day digging. The ground was hard. Stubborn. Like the lion. He buried Kuma beneath the ledge where he'd last roared. Laid stones around the grave, one for each week they'd lived side by side. No plaque. No marker. Just presence. Just memory. That night, Daniel lit a fire and sat alone. For hours he didn't move. Then, when the moon rose, he turned on the old camera one last time. He looked into the lens and said, "He didn't need saving. He just needed someone to stay. And sometimes, that's all any of us need." He clicked the camera off. And wept. Not for the lion. The morning came heavy with silence. No bird call, no distant jackal wails, just a stillness that clung to the skin like grief. Daniel sat by the ridge, his boots planted in dust still streaked from the storm. Beside him, Leo lay curled beneath a gnarled acacia, his breath audible now only when the wind stilled long enough to let it be heard. The lion had not moved much since the night he fell. His right foreleg, twisted awkwardly beneath his body, had swollen grotesquely. Daniel had splinted it with strips of canvas and carved branches, but there was a limit to what could be done without surgical tools. And Leo wouldn't allow any more intervention. He barely opened his eyes when Daniel approached now. Yet he never growled. Never turned away. It was as if the last remnants of wildness in him had softened, not out of weakness, but out of an ancient recognition that something had shifted. In Daniel. In both of them. Daniel's phone had long since died, and the radio in the Jeep crackled nothing but static. Days ago, he'd managed to send out a single garbled message from a ridge with a faint signal, pleading for veterinary backup. But nothing had come. He wasn't sure if help was on the way or if his message had vanished into the ether like everything else out here eventually did. He brought Leo water again, cupping it in a metal bowl, steadying the lion's head gently. The lion drank slowly, eyes fluttering closed after each swallow. His once golden mane was matted now, streaked with earth, thorn, and dried blood. Daniel ran his hand down the lion's side, counting each rib with quiet ache. There was no denying it anymore. Leo wasn't healing. That afternoon, as the heat settled in and the flies returned, Daniel sat in the Jeep with his hands on the wheel, staring at the loaded tranquilizer gun on the passenger seat. It wasn't meant for this. He'd brought it as a precaution in case the lion lashed out in confusion or fear. But now, as Leo's pain deepened into something almost spiritual, Daniel realized the gun had become a different kind of decision. Not one of survival. One of mercy. He closed his eyes and remembered the lion standing proud and defiant in the first days. The way his frame filled the valley. The way even his silence felt loud. That creature was gone, but not erased. Something of him still lingered behind those tired amber eyes. As dusk gathered and the sun flared behind the ridge like a dying torch, Daniel approached the lion once more. He knelt beside him, hands shaking. "You don't have to fight anymore," he whispered, voice cracking. "You gave more than the world ever deserved from you." Leo blinked once. Slowly. Then let out a low, gravelly breath, a sound not quite pain, not quite relief. Just surrender. Daniel raised the tranquilizer. Then stopped. In the far distance, a faint engine noise emerged, growing louder, tires cracking over stone. A dust trail. A second Jeep. He stood up, heart pounding. A vet stepped out, a tall, wiry woman named Dr. Adrian Wexler. She was older than Daniel, hair in a braid, eyes sharp with the clarity of someone who'd seen too many of these moments. "You're the one who sent the call?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "You're late." "I know," she said, eyes on the lion. "But maybe not too late." They worked in silence, swift and sure. Dr. Wexler administered fluids, pain medication, stronger antibiotics. She didn't promise recovery, but she did promise comfort. And dignity. That night, Daniel sat beside Leo once more. The stars were out, scattered like old bones across the sky. The lion slept, not unconscious, just deeply at peace. For the first time in days, his breathing had steadied. Daniel whispered, "If you want to go, it's okay. But if you've still got something left in you, just a little, then fight. I'll stay. Either way." And then it happened. Leo raised his head, not high, not bold, but just enough. His eyes met Daniel's. And there, between man and beast, passed something. Wordless. Not a plea. Not thanks. But memory. Recognition. The lion was not a pet. Not a symbol. Not a metaphor. He was simply himself, whole, weathered, and still alive. And in that fragile, fleeting moment beneath the stars, Daniel realized the truth. Some goodbyes don't need words. Some bonds don't need explanation. Some stories don't end, they just change shape. He lay down beside Leo, head resting against the old lion's flank. Together, they listened to the earth breathe. And for a little while longer, Leo stayed. The lion's grave lay beneath a sun-bleached acacia, unmarked but not forgotten. Birds sang over the valley he once ruled, and the wind carried his story far beyond the savannah. And the man, silent, older now, still returned every year, not to mourn, but to remember. Because sometimes the most powerful bonds are born not in youth or glory, but in the quiet act of not walking away.